All right, hi everyone. I think we'll get a start on this. So first of all, it's really exciting to welcome you all here. We've got a fantastic event coming up with Daniel Gordis from Israel. For those who don't know me, my name is Armistice Lines. I'm the Israel Affairs Director for the Zionist Council of New South Wales. Before we begin with Daniel, whom Rodney Nunberg, our president, will introduce more formally, just wanted to give a very few small housekeeping guidelines. First of all, as you will notice, everyone here is on mute. That is intentional, but that is only so that this runs smoothly and efficiently and we get through on time. What will happen is after Rodney introduces Daniel will speak for about 30 minutes or so. We'll then have time for some Q&A. We've had a lot of really great questions already submitted to us. But during this session, if you have any questions, you will see at the bottom of your screen there's a chat button. Please just submit your question there and we will do our best to get through with that. And at the end, our amazing VP, Vice President Orly, will close this session. So with that, Rodney, I'll pass it over to you to formally introduce our speaker and get this event on the road. Rodney.
Thank you. Bruchim Haba. Welcome to all our viewers around Australia and further afield. Firstly, a very big thank you to Jeremy and Roxanne Dunkel, who assist the Zionist Council of New South Wales in sponsoring various advocacy projects, including tonight's session. I am honoured and have much pleasure in introducing Dr. Daniel Gordis, who is Senior Vice President and Correct Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College in Jerusalem, and has authored numerous books on Israel, Zionism, and Jewish topics. He has twice received the National Jewish Book Award for his books, Saving Israel, How the Jewish People Can Win a War That May Never End, and Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. He's a regular columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and the Jerusalem Post, and a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Times of Israel, and other leading news outlets. Dr. Gordis lectures throughout the world on Israel society, American-Israel relations, and the challenges facing the Jewish state. Dr. Gordis made Aliyah from America in 1998. I could spend the whole hour on the introduction. However, I'm sure everyone, like myself, is anxious to hear from Dr. Gordis. So without further ado, I hand over to him.
Thank you very much, Rodney, and thanks to all of you for joining in for what for you is this evening and for me is this afternoon. Pleasure to see a few familiar faces, and I want to also begin by thanking Richard Balkin for having reached out during his tenure to ask me to honor me by asking me to be a part of this conversation. As some of you may know, my wife and I have had the really extraordinary privilege of spending two extended trips in Australia, once in Melbourne and once in Sydney. So I feel that though I don't know the community intimately, I certainly have somewhat of a feel for it, and certainly an appreciation for the profundity of its educational enterprises, which are really world-class. And I have to say, as an American, far beyond what the vast majority of American Judaism has been able to produce. So it's always an inspiration to either be in Sydney or Melbourne with you, or to be speaking with the communities from afar. And once again, I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to spend this time with you. What I would like to suggest before I share the screen so I can put a PowerPoint up, so you shouldn't be punished by having to stare at my face the entire time of this event. What I'd like to suggest is that this is an appropriate time of the Jewish year for us to be thinking the big questions about how we are using our time, how we're using the years that we are blessed to have. And this, of course, is a time in the history of the world when many of us are asking ourselves all kinds of important things about what matters, what doesn't matter. I think we're experiencing, almost even on a physical level, how much many of us miss just simple encounters with other human beings, and how the need to sit at a table with someone and have a Shabbat dinner, or to sit outside and have a glass of wine, is a kind of a physical need, no more than being thirsty or having to go to sleep because you're tired. We're all learning a tremendous amount about all kinds of important things. And given that we're in this mode of both because of the Yamim Noraim just coming up and because of the world is asking ourselves important questions, I wanted to take this opportunity to think with you about a subject that is important to all of us, which is the degree to which we are doing Israel education in a way that meets the needs of young people in the 21st century. And of course, by virtue of the fact that I'm asking the question, I'm going to suggest that we do need to rethink it a little bit. And again, what I'm going to say is based mostly on my experience with American Jewry, but reading extensively about what's going on in Australia. And as I said, having been fortunate enough to visit a number of occasions and to see the extraordinary schools there. So I want to take a specifically American example, the latest little kerfuffle with Seth Rogen. I'm sure everybody in this call has read about it. The Canadian comedian and filmmaker who now lives in America, who got himself into some hot water with the Jewish community because of what he said about Israel. And I want to just suggest that what he said is an opportunity for us to rethink ourselves, not to criticize him necessarily, although most of us don't agree with most of what he said, but to rethink ourselves and the way in which we're thinking about teaching Israel and so forth. So I'll share the screen now, and then I'll unshare it towards the end, and then of course completely unshare it when we have the question and answer period, so we can see each other and talk together. So what I want to do is to suggest something about rethinking Israel education for the 21st century. And as I said a moment or two ago, I want to try to do it with your permission by way of beginning with Seth Rogen. Now here's a brief discussion of Seth Rogen in Yisrael Hayom. Yisrael Hayom, as I'm sure many of you know, is the newspaper that is funded by Sheldon Adelson, is very supportive in this particular moment of Israel's Netanyahu government, but that has absolutely nothing to do with this specific issue. Seth Rogen came out and said what he said, and we'll talk about what he said in just a minute. And here was what I think is a really very standard response. His comments illustrate a fraying Israel diaspora tie. Israel has long benefited from financial and political support from American Jews. Again, it focuses on America here because Sheldon Adelson, the person who funds the newspaper, is very American. But in recent years, the country has faced a groundswell of opposition from young progressives who embrace the Palestinian narrative. And obviously, no Jewish community is monolithic. But I know that this is true to a lesser extent in Australia, but I think it's still true to some extent in Australia. That we're seeing a younger generation that is more conflicted about what we're teaching it about Israel. And I want to suggest, therefore, a younger generation that needs to be addressed in a different kind of a way. And what I want to do, therefore, is to talk about two different things that Seth Rogen said. Talk about two major comments that he made about the Jewish education that he got and the way that he sees Israel, and then talk about how I think we need to respond. And here's the first one. And again, let's remember that Seth Rogen is a comedian, right? I mean, he's a comedian, he's a filmmaker, he's hardly a political theorist, he's hardly a great Zionist writer or anything of the sort. So I'm using him really only as a litmus test of where standard people who are educated, be it United States, Canada, probably even Australia, might find themselves. And here's what he says. To me, and these are just screenshots from Times of Israel, if I'm not mistaken, it just seems an antiquated thought process. If it is for religious reasons, whatever that means, by the way, I don't agree with it because I think religion is silly. Okay, so he's not a deeply committed religious Jew, perfectly fine. If it is truly for the preservation of the Jewish people, it makes no sense because, again, you don't keep something you're trying to preserve all in one place, especially when that place is proven to be pretty volatile, you know? I'm trying to keep all these things safe. I'm going to put them in my blender and hope that that's the best place. That'll do it. Okay, again, now he's a comedian, but I want to suggest this. I think that even if we went to some of the best schools around the world, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, and in other important Jewish communities, and we were to ask the graduates of these best schools, why does the Jewish people need a Jewish state? And again, I'm not asking now what we teach them or what we think we teach them. What I'm asking about is what would they say if we asked them that question? And I'm going to suggest that this is true, by the way, even of the finest students from the finest Australian schools, regardless of what we think we're teaching them. If we were to ask them, why does the Jewish people need a Jewish state? They would mostly say something like, because the Jews need a place to go. The Jews need a homeland. The Jews need a place to make themselves safe, or if people have to leave South America or North America or anywhere else, there needs to be a place for them to go. Now, that is, of course, partly true, but I think what it does is it makes Israel seem very antiquated. Young Jewish people in Melbourne and in Sydney, to say nothing of other places in Australia, are not are not getting up in the morning and wondering when they're going to have to flee Australia. They're just not. In the same way, by the way, that most American Jews, despite the outburst of anti-Semitism that we've seen lately in the United States, and that is actually quite alarming, but even despite the outburst of anti-Semitism in the United States, young Jews in Boston, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Florida, other places are not getting up in the morning and asking themselves, when am I going to have to flee America and go to Israel? And therefore, as long as we speak about Israel fundamentally as a place of sanctuary, a place where Jews can go if they need to, I'm going to suggest that, like Seth Rogen's case, people are going to feel that, it's a nice idea. It's an important idea for those other Jews out there who might need it. But it doesn't matter to me all that much if I'm a young Australian Jew, because I'm not going to need a sanctuary. But what I think we need to remind ourselves and them, of course, is that's not actually the most important reason that Israel was created. And I want to give you two examples from two very important poems, two leading Israeli poetic people. One is Chaim Nachman Bialik, and the other is Nathan Alterman, whom we'll see in a minute, and show you that what Zionists really thought they were doing was not only creating a safe haven. What Zionists thought they were doing was actually to reimagine the Jew, to reinvent the Jew. Zionism was actually about the recreation of the Jew, or the creation, if we want to put it this way, the creation of a new Jew. Many of you know, of course, that there was a terrible pogrom in Kishinev in 1903, and shortly after that, Chaim Nachman Bialik wrote this very, very long poem called The Ir HaHariga, in the city of slaughter, of which I've taken only a few lines here. This is a very difficult, very painful, very graphic scene here. So I only read it because it's become really a Jewish classic. There's nothing fun or enjoyable about meeting this text. And the horror that he's describing is really unspeakable. But we need to understand what Bialik is saying here to understand where Zionism is, again, long before the Jewish state. The Jewish state's obviously created in 48, and this poem appears some 45 years before there's a Jewish state. And he says, at a certain point, as a person is being shown around Kishinev and saying, this is what happened here, and that's what happened there, then they bring them into a cellar. And here's what the narrator of the poem says about what happened in the cellar. Note also, do not fail to note, in that dark corner behind that cask, crouched husbands, bridegrooms, brothers, peering from the cracks, watching the sacred, it's a typo there, the sacred bodies struggling underneath the bestial breath, stifling filth and swallowing their blood, watching from the darkness in its mesh, the lecherous rabble portioning for booty their kindred and their flesh. In other words, what we have here horribly is a rape scene, and we know that there were rapes in the Kishinev pogrom. But what Bialik is saying here, again, it's probably not historically accurate, but he's trying to say something about the Jews of Kishinev, which again may or may not have been fair, but there's a lot that's been written about what happened in Kishinev, and Bialik captures some of it, and some of it he doesn't quite capture, intentionally, by the way, because he went to Kishinev and he interviewed people at great length. He knew exactly what did and did not happen, but he's trying to make a point about the Jewish people. And what he's saying here, of course, in that third line is that husbands and bridegrooms and brothers, they crouch behind cracks, behind, walls, barrels, whatever. They're watching what's happening, but they're doing nothing. Here's what he says. Crushed in their shame, they saw it all. They did not stir nor move. They did not pluck their eyes out. They beat not their brains against the wall. Perhaps each watcher had it in his heart to pray, a miracle, O Lord, and spare my skin this day. Now Bialik makes something up that did not happen. So let's understand that this is great literature. The thing that what you ask yourself after you read Macbeth or after you read the Canterbury Tales is not, is that true? What you ask yourself is, what is the author trying to say about the human condition? Or in this particular case, what is Chaim Nachman Bialik trying to say about the Jewish condition? And here's what he says. Those who survived this foulness from a flood their blood awoke, beheld their life polluted, the life of their world gone out. How did their menfolk bear it? How did they bear this yoke? They crawled forth from their holes. They fled to the house of the Lord. They offered thanks to him, the sweet benedictory word. The Kohanim sallied forth to the rabbi's house. They flitted. Tell me, O rabbi, tell, is my wife permitted? A kind of a horrifying halachic question, right? If your wife has just been raped, is she still permitted to you? It's a horrifying question. Nobody asked it in Kishinev. And Bialik understood that nobody asked it. He's accusing the men, and he's accusing, therefore, the Jewish community in general of simply being weak. right? The matter ends and nothing more, and all as is as it was before. In other words, what Bialik's saying here is that we're going to go back to life as usual. There's been this horrible crime perpetrated on the Jewish people, but the men, and he's accusing the men here, but he's speaking really largely about the Jewish world. What's the problem? Bialik says there's really a variety of problems. Number one, you're weak. You're weak. I mean, this is what the Jewish people have become. The Cossacks come into town and you're unable to defend yourself. By the way, I want to reiterate, it's not entirely true. The Jews of Kishinev did defend themselves in certain cases, but they weren't able to stop the butchery. But again, Bialik is using Kishinev. He's not a historian, he's a poet, right? And this poem is going to literally set the entire Jewish world on fire. This poem is going to be the engine that animates the Zionist machine for a very, very, very long time. And what he says, first of all, you're weak. Okay, I mean, that's not a crime to be weak, but there's certainly nothing to be proud of. But worse than weak, he says, is that you're cowards. Because it's one thing to be weak, but it's worse to be a coward. Why are you hiding behind there while the worst possible thing imaginable happens to the women who are the most important people in your life? In other words, what are you doing hiding? Even if you're going to get killed trying to defend them, get killed trying to defend them. What's this hiding business? Praying to God to help you while the most horrific thing possible is unfolding. And then Bialik says it's worse than the fact that you're weak. And it's worse than the fact that you're a coward. The worst thing of all is that this world of rabbinic Judaism, this world of halachic Judaism has killed the human being in you, because you step out from behind that wall or behind that lattice work or behind that barrel and you stare at the broken bodies of these people who are the most important people in your life. And what do you see on the ground? Don't forget they're alive, right? If you're going to the rabbi to ask, is my wife permitted? Well, obviously we're talking about human beings who are alive. Bialik says you don't go to the rabbi's house. You sit down next to them and you hold them. And you tell them that it'll be okay, even though, by the way, it will never be okay. And you tell them that you love them. When you look down at a human being and what you see is a halachic question, Bialik is saying, don't forget, Bialik, like many of the early Zionists, had grown up in the halachic world and had abandoned it, right? I mean, that was true of many, many people. Not all, but many. And therefore, he's angry at that world. And what he's saying is, what's wrong with the Jewish world? We're weak. We're cowards. We've lost our humanity. That's what Zionism is about. Zionism is about not only having a refuge, would Bialik have said. Zionism is about creating a new kind of Jew. And part of what ails us as Jewish educators and as Zionist educators in the first quarter of the 21st century is that we've been overwhelmingly successful. That Zionism has been so successful at reimagining the Jew that young people like Seth Rogen or high school students in the United States or Canada or Australia don't remember anymore how much the existence of a Jewish state has changed the way that we think about what it means to be a Jew. So I'll show you again another very important poem. Now this one not by Bialik, but this one by Natan Alterman. And you can see right above the picture of the 200 shekel bill that has his photograph there. And the reason, by the way, on the previous screen, I put the 100 lira bill from 1,000 years ago of Chaim Nachman Bialik and the relatively new 200 shekel bill with Alterman is to show you the importance given to the literary word in the state of Israel. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that we have not only political figures whose images are on our currency, but also important literary figures. And that, I think, says a tremendous amount. And this poem, as you can see right above that image of the bill there, is published in Davar on December 26, 1947, which means that it's just about a month after the United Nations vote on the 29th of November, and it's about 5 months before Ben Gurion will declare independence on May 14th, 1948, on the 5th of Iyar. And this is the entirety of a poem that Natan Alterman writes in that intermittent period. The War of Independence has already begun. It's not against the standing armies, it's against more unorganized Arabs, but the war is already on. And here's what he writes: the land was silent. The incarnate sun flickered languidly above the smoldering borders, and a nation stood, cloven-hearted but breathing, to receive the miracle, the one miracle and only. The nation made way for the pomp. It rose to the crescent moon and stood there at pre-dawn, garbed in festival and fear. And then out they came, a boy and a girl, pacing slowly toward the nation. Now, we don't have a lot of time together this evening, so I want to do this a little bit less Socratically than might be appropriate or ideal. But we have the entire nation, he says in the first stanza, the entire nation stood waiting to receive the miracle, the one miracle and only. And obviously for traditional Jews, when the entire nation gathers together to receive the miracle, what immediately comes to mind, of course, is Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai and the Jewish people getting ready to receive the Torah. And what had Moshe instructed them during the Shloshet Yemei Hagbalah, the 3 days of preparation for the receiving of the Torah? He told them to wash their clothes, that men should not approach women, and so on and so forth. And here's what Alterman writes: in workaday garb and bandolier and heavy shod, up the path they silently came forward. They did not change their dress. He doesn't ever mention the book of Exodus, but this is clearly a play on the books of Exodus, which most people back then would have gotten. They did not change their dress, and they had not yet washed away the marks of the arduous day and the night of the fire line. Tired, oh so tired, forsworn of rest and oozing sap of young Hebrewness. Not Jewishness now, Hebrewness. We're moving away from Sinai. Just like Bialik had said, the problem with you Jews is that you're weak and you're cowardly and you see broken bodies that are still alive as halachic questions and not as human beings. Here too, Alterman says, we're moving away. This is that early on hyper-secular move in Zionism, which is long since gone. I mean, the hyper-secularism of Zionism has ended a long time ago, but that's a different conversation altogether. Silently, the two approach, right? The two approach together, the boy and the girl. They're not separated the way that Exodus said they should be. Stood there unmoving. There was no saying whether they were alive or shot. Now, don't forget, well, we don't normally say alive or shot. We say alive or dead. But what Alterman is saying here is a follow-up on Bialik, right? Bialik has said you might have gotten killed defending your wives or your sisters or your mothers or your daughters or whatever, but at least you would have died defending them. And what Alterman says here is the opposite alive is not dead. The opposite of alive is shot. In other words, we're no longer in a period in which Jews are simply going to die hiding. This is during the War of Independence. The boy and the girl come out. They're not washing their clothes. They're not changing their clothes. They're not separating from each other, because this is an abandonment of Sinai, implies Alterman, and it's the embrace of a new way of saving the Jewish people. And then the nation, tear-rinsed, spellbound, asked, saying, "Who are you?" And the two sighed their reply, "We are the silver platter on which the Jewish state was given to you." They spoke, and then enveloped the shadow at people's feet they fell. The rest will be told in the annals of Israel. In other words, this too, by the way, is a continuation of what Bialik was saying before in the previous poem. This is about creating a new kind of a Jew. And therefore, the first thing that I think needs to be said to a person like Seth Rogen, again, not in taking him on and arguing with him, but simply say, when you have this idea that what the Jewish state is about, that it's a refuge, it's a sanctuary, it's a place that Jews can run to, and then you say, well, how much sense does that make? I mean, why would we all run to the Middle East when it's so conflict-ridden? Say to them, actually, that's wrong. That's not why we created this state. We didn't create the state mostly to have a refuge. We created the state to reimagine the Jew. And part of the reason that we don't think about that anymore is because it's become so taken for granted. But it's a hugely important part of what the Jewish state was really all about. Now, let's look at the second thing that he says, and I'm going a little quickly just because I know that we're going to run out of time. He also says, and this is, again, a major critique that we hear from young people, and I know that this comes up in Australia too, from talking to my Australian friends who are involved in Jewish education, those who still live there and those who've made Aliyah since they work there. And here's what Rogan says, and I also think that as a Jewish person, I was fed a huge amount of lies about Israel my entire life. They never told me that, oh, by the way, there were people living there. They make it seem like it was just sitting there, like the door is open. They forget to include that fact to every young Jewish person. And here's what people like Rogan are exposed to, right? This is the kind of a map scene that you can find in literally hundreds of places all over the internet. And it shows you in green the shrinking amount of land accorded to the Palestinians. So this is, again, of course, from a Palestinian website. It goes without saying. But they'll show you that historic Palestine, which of course doesn't really exist in any meaningful way, but historic Palestine was 100% of what we would call Israel today. Then the United Nations partition plan gave it only 44%. They don't point out all kinds of other things that we'll talk about in a minute. And then by 1967, because of Israel's victory in the war, it was down to 22%. And this last map, the 2020 map, of course, is the Trump peace proposal, which has them getting, as they would say, 15%. And young Jews very often look at maps like this, or they hear about it when they go to university, and they come home and they scratch their heads and they say, how come nobody talked to me about this? And by the way, it may not be that we're not talking to them about it, but it is not sinking in. It is just not sinking in. And when people ask them, well, how do you justify what's happened to the Palestinian people over the course of all of this? In America, and this is obviously a very American example I'm going to give you now, they think of it as just something like this. In other words, the land held by American Indians, right? And the maps go on and on and on. And just as, you know, the people that came from Europe mostly just took that land away, period after period after period. And obviously before 1850, much more of that area would have been shaded in black. And young American Jews think, oh my God, we know that what happened to Native Americans is completely wrong. And therefore, what happened to Palestinians must also be completely wrong. There's no moral way I can really justify what happened to Native Americans in the United States. There's no moral way that I can justify that. And therefore, there's probably, if the maps show a similar kind of a thing, there's no moral way that I could possibly justify what happened to the Palestinians. Now, before I argue that I think we can make an argument about that, I do want to say that I think it's important for us as Jews to not deny the horror of what happened to the Palestinian people. There were some 1.2 million Palestinians in what we would now call Israel on the eve of the war, and some 700,000 of them lost their homes. How, why, who, etc. That's very complicated. We're not going to go into that today. But some 60 to 65% of Palestinians in the land of Israel lost their homes during that war. And I want to suggest that regardless of where our politics are, left, right, Zionist, less Zionist, I think that as Jews, we ought to acknowledge, especially before the Yamim Noraim, I don't think Jewishness demands of us that we ignore the suffering of others, no matter who they might be. In fact, I think that Judaism would demand of us quite the opposite. So when I see pictures like this, and there's hundreds of them, but when I see pictures like this of Palestinians during the War of Independence, who bundled up their houses, took whatever they could, and set out on the road, not really knowing where they were going to go, where they were going to end up. I think it's very sad. And obviously, I'm a very deeply committed Zionist. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem. My wife and I made Aliyah a long time ago, and I'm going to explain to you how I talk about these kinds of pictures in just a minute. But I think we have to understand that our children and our grandchildren and our students and our congregants are going to see pictures like this, and they're going to see maps like the ones that we saw, and therefore we have to be able to talk to them about, well, how is that possible? In other words, if this map is really impossible to justify from a moral perspective, how do we justify maps like this from a moral perspective? And what are we supposed to say as Jews when we see pictures like this? And here's where I think history really comes in. And again, I know that we do teach this, but I don't think it's sinking in enough. And I say this from talking again, as I've said, to my friends who grew up in Australia, who now live in Israel, and so on and so forth. And it's certainly true, even more, I'm sure, in the United States. But what all of these dates, and I didn't include all the dates that one could, but what all these dates have in common, of course, is that they are moments in which Palestinians completely rejected the possibility of living side by side with Jews in the land of Israel. So the Peel Commission, which I'm sure most people on this call know about, was the first attempt by anyone, the British in this particular case, to divide the land of Israel. They said in 1937, there's just no way that these two peoples, the Jews and the Arabs, are going to be able to live together. What we have to do is create two different states. Now, two states now sounds like a very old idea, but in 1937, it was a very brand new idea. And they, in fact, said, by the way, we're going to have to move the Jews in the Arab area out and into the Jewish area, and we're going to have to move the Arabs in the Jewish areas out and put them in the Arab area, we're going to actually have to do transfer, what we call transfer today. The British said unabashedly that was what was going to happen, because otherwise it was never going to happen. The Jews hated the map that came along with the Peel Commission. We won't go into it now, but it was a worse map than they would have liked to have seen by a long shot. Although, and it was worse, by the way, than the 1947 map that you just saw a moment ago. But the Jews, as unhappy as they were with the map, said okay to the Peel Commission, and of course the Arabs rejected it. We all know that the 1947 United Nations partition plan was accepted by the Jews, was rejected by the Arabs. We know, moving along, that in 1949, when the War of Independence was over, what becomes the 1949 Armistice Lines, which everybody talks about as being the sacred 1967 borders, or pre-1967 borders, those were not borders. Those were only armistice lines, because the Arabs said, okay, that's where the fighting stopped. That's what where the line will get drawn right now, but we're going to be back. They said that without any ambiguity whatsoever, we're going to be back for round two, and we're going to destroy the Jewish state. And when they tried to do that in 1967, and of course failed, and Israel's tripled its size in 6 days in 1967, they then went to Khartoum, which, as you know, is in the Sudan. And there they made the very famous Khartoum Declaration: no peace, no recognition, no negotiations. And then all of us, of course, on this conversation can remember what happened in Camp David in 2000, when Ehud Barak made a relatively generous gesture, and they rejected that too. They, in the form of Yasser Arafat, rejected that too and unleashed the second Intifada. And then 20 years later, just a few months ago, Trump puts forward the plan that he calls whatever, the plan for peace and whatever, and they reject it. And then Mike Pompeo, you can be a great fan of the Trump administration or not a great fan of the Trump administration, and a great fan of Mike Pompeo, who's the Secretary of State, or not a great fan of Mike Pompeo. But he did say to them at that day that the plan was released. He said, if you don't like this, put something else on the table. And of course, nothing else has come on the table. What I think we have failed to do to prepare our students to understand maps like this, or to deal at university with photographs like this or like this, among many others, is to point out that time after time after time and again, the Jewish people has desperately wanted there to be an arrangement with the Palestinians in the land of Israel so we could live side by side. We would probably have less land than we wanted. They would have less land than they wanted. That's what compromise always is. It's just the nature of the beast. And here I'll just bring in the words of a very, very famous Israeli historian who is, those of you who know what's called the New Historian School in Israel know that they are hardly on the right. They are, in fact, many of them very much on the hard left. Benny Morris is no longer on the hard left. I'd call him a centrist, but nonetheless, he is somebody who's a very seriously taken historian. And I just want to read for you what he said in an interview with Ari Shavit in Haaretz in 2004, really 15, 16 years ago. So Haaretz says to him, for decades, you've been researching what Haaretz calls, of course, the dark side of Zionism. You're an expert on the atrocities, against Haaretz's word, not mine, of 1948. In the end, do you justify all this? Are you an advocate of transfer? And here's what Benny Morris, who Haaretz, you can tell already, in the form of Ari Shavit, is trying to get a certain answer. Benny Morris says this: there's no justification for acts of rape. And by the way, there were basically no acts of rape on the part of the Jews in 1948. There were claims that there were, but there were basically virtually none. There was no justification for acts of massacre. Those are war crimes. But he says, in certain cases, expulsion is not a war crime. I don't think that the expulsions of 1948 were war crimes. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. You have to dirty your hands. And Ari Shavit says to him, we're talking about the killing of thousands of people, the destruction of an entire society, which of course is slightly exaggerated, I would argue. And then Benny Morris says this important thing here: a society that aims to kill you forces you to destroy it. When the choice is between destroying or being destroyed, it's better to destroy. Here's what we do not make clear enough. Even though we say it, as I said before, I don't think it's seeking in. To young people who go off to university today, when they see those kinds of photographs, when they see the map of the shrinking Palestinian territory, they don't know what to say, because what they don't remember is that there was an era in which Israel was not as powerful as it is now. There was an era in which the existence of the Jewish state was not nearly as guaranteed as it is today. It's not guaranteed absolutely today, but we're in a pretty good position on the security front today. We have to remember that the states that the United Nations created in the partition plan of 1947, the land was split not quite evenly, but more or less evenly. But the Jewish state was only going to be 55% Jewish. The territory that the United Nations gave to the Jews in 1947 was 55% Jewish, 45% Arab. Whereas the Arab state was some 90% Arab, 10% Jewish, meaning that if they had only said yes, we probably would not be having this conversation today. If they had only said, okay, we don't like these maps, but we'll take it, the state that was going to be the Arab state would of course remain an Arab state. And the state that was supposed to be the Jewish state might not have survived. You can't survive as a state with 45% of your population being antipathetic to the very purpose of the state. It almost for sure would have collapsed. But it didn't collapse because they attacked. And it didn't collapse because they gave up the two-state solution then and time and time and time again. And I think therefore what it's important for us to do as we rethink Israel education on, as we move into the second quarter of the 21st century is not because what we're saying has been wrong, but because what we're saying has not sunk in enough. I think it's critically important that we point to two things. First of all, this was not a place that built out of the need for refuge. To teach young Jews in Australia, whether they're in Melbourne or Sydney or anywhere else, that what Israel's about is a refuge for Jews. I mean, who needs a refuge for Jews if you live in fantastic Jewish communities like the ones that you live in? Who needs a refuge? Of course, there's some anti-Semitism in Australia. Of course, there's lots of anti-Semitism in the United States, but Australian Jews aren't going to have to run anywhere, and American Jews aren't going to have to run anywhere. And this idea of Israel as a refuge, I think, takes the spotlight away from what the really extraordinary dimension of Israel is, which is that it's in Israel that we are actually reimagining the Jew. That what was important about Bialik and Alterman back then, and that's what's important about all the stuff that you see coming out of Israel now, right? I mean, what's Shtisel about? Shtisel's a cute soap opera on one level, but what it's really about is, don't forget, Shtisel was a most watched show in Israel. Why? Not by the Haredim. The Haredim weren't the ones watching it. So why are secular Israelis watching a show about Haredim? Because while they don't want to be that, they understand that there's a kind of a deep-seated joy about life, that they want to know what's the magic of that way of life. This hostile antipathy towards Jewish tradition has long since evaporated in Israel. Not everybody's becoming religious, to be sure, but people are open to studying and to learning. And what's really still going on in Israel, and what's fascinating about what's going on in Israel, is this continual exploration of what should the new Jew be? Who should she be? What can he be? What should the new Jew look like? And if you're familiar with Shmuel Rosner's new book called Israeli Judaism, what he shows you is that a variety of Judaism is coming up here. It doesn't exist anywhere else. It doesn't exist in Europe. It doesn't exist in Australia. It doesn't exist in America. There's a kind of Judaism that's a kind of a blend of Jewish tradition and nationalism that exists only in Israel. And we have to start speaking about the purpose of Israel as being a place where we can reimagine what the Jewish people can be and what Jewishness should be, and not as a refuge, because refuge doesn't speak to young people anymore. And the other part of what I was saying is that I think it is very uncomfortable for us to talk about what happened to one of the populations that was here in 1947, 48, and 49, because it's sad. It's just sad. And I think that anybody that wants to deny that is being callous unnecessarily and in a way that I think the Jewish tradition neither asks us to be or would want us to be. It is sad. It is tragic. But the question is, why did it happen? And unless our children and our grandchildren and our students and our congregants, when they go to university campuses, can articulate that there was an offer made in 37 and it was turned down, that an offer made in 47 and it was turned down, and the offer made in 47 was barely tenable because that Jewish state was 55% Jewish and 45% Arab. How many of them even know that? And if they don't know that, how are they supposed to engage in a different kind of a conversation? So what I wanted to suggest by way of getting our new year started together, that it's a new year not only in which we hope and pray that some of the horrors that we have all as universal human beings suffered this year, some of those horrors will disappear and go away. and that we'll actually have a Shana Tova, which will be hopefully, God willing, a healthy year for everyone. And we'll have a year in which hopefully the world will right itself in all those places where politically things are in turmoil. But even more importantly, perhaps it can be a year of renewing our thinking about how we teach about what is obviously the greatest Jewish accomplishment in the last 2,000 years. What exists in Israel is without question, despite the extraordinary communities in Australia, the United States, and Europe, and elsewhere. What exists in Israel is still by far the most extraordinary recreation of the Jewish world in the last 2,000 years. It's critically important that young people in our communities learn to appreciate it and love it. Whether they plan to live here or not is entirely incidental and unimportant at that moment, for that moment. And therefore, I've been trying to argue it's important for us to rethink what their questions are and how we teach them in anticipation of what those questions are going to be, so that, like their parents and grandparents, they will live lives of deep and passionate Jewish commitment, but also deep and passionate Zionist commitment. So I'll stop with that and take it from here, open it up, and thank you, of course, for giving me an opportunity to share some of those thoughts with you.
Daniel, thank you so much for that. I think it's safe to say you're in Jerusalem, our audience is in Australia. In these COVID times, that is about as socially distant as you can, with the exception of New Zealand, as socially distant as you can get. But truly, thank you so much for that, as always, thought-provoking and challenging, and really getting your audience to think outside the comfort zones, which a good educator always does. So thank you again for that.
Thank you.
We have a lot of questions. I'm going to try and get through all of them, but I did want to take the liberty of asking the first one, if I may, before we get to our audience. You mentioned Seth Rogen, which I actually thought of asking you beforehand, but I wanted to ask you about another. I'm sorry to Americanize it, but another American celebrity, so to speak, Peter Beinart, famous Jewish commentator as well, and he wrote an op-ed in the Jewish Currents, which was only published in the New York Times, and you had a very public, let's just say, engagement with him about it. And in his thesis, so to speak, and we're talking about what is Zionism, what is the very purpose of the Jewish state, the modern Jewish state. And Beinart said in his piece essentially that Zionism was simply a home for Jewish people in the land of Israel, but not necessarily a Jewish state. And he went on essentially to say that he no longer believes in the need for the existence of a Jewish state, and more or less called for a binational state, which ultimately, as we know, is a euphemism for the annihilation of the Jewish state in its modern form. Now, when you spoke out against it, you referred to him as, I believe, an enemy of our people and a traitor. So I was curious, perhaps, if you can enlighten us a little bit about sort of, did Beinart cross that red line? Did he go over the boundary? And how do we deal with these views, which I presume are only gaining prominence, not only outside the Jewish community, but especially within even elements of the Jewish community? How do we respond to that, and how do we educate against that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for the excellent question. And obviously, Peter Beinart and I have engaged on many occasions. We've actually been on the same stage together on a number of occasions, and there's lots of YouTubes of it, and you can easily find them. And we did a podcast together for a number of times, because I wanted to show that even people who disagree very, very strenuously about a whole array of issues can have a very civil conversation, especially in the United States. And here I don't know so much about Australia, but certainly inside the Jewish community of the United States, the conversation about Israel has not only become strident, it's become openly hostile and toxic. And I was just trying to show people that while Peter and I don't agree, we can at least have a podcast together and have a civil conversation, or be on a stage together at a shul or a community center and have a civil conversation. I won't do that anymore. And I made it very clear. In fact, a leading American university just reached out to me this week, asking me to appear with him, obviously on Zoom, but still on a shared whatever. And the answer to that is just no, I won't do it. And the reason I think that he crossed a red line here is because you, first of all, pointed out correctly yourself, a one-state solution or a binational state is really a euphemism, not only for the destruction of the Jewish state, but let's be very honest, it's a euphemism for the murder of millions of Jews. I mean, just let's look at the reality of the world in which we live. I mean, the idea that Jews and Arabs are suddenly going to get along in Israel and we don't need to protect our own lives, or we can be partners with Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza and safeguarding Jews. I mean, the idea is just ludicrous. And it seems to me that either, if you really believe that, then, I mean, I just don't know how much history you actually know. And if you don't believe it, but you're saying it to, make yourself more beloved by the progressive circles in which you live, then I think it's actually treasonous. And that's why I said what I said. I think the issue is this. I mean, Peter likes to say early on, as you pointed out, that, Zionism wasn't always about a state. Zionism, for some people like Achad Ha'am, and he gives others, Achad Ha'am, and, many, he says, it was about having some sort of Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. Aside from the fact that it's unrealistic, just unrealistic, and it won't happen, and it would be wiped out completely. Aside from that little small fact, the reality is it's like saying, well, what feminism is about giving women the vote. And that's all it's about, right? There was a period of time when women's suffrage was the main issue. But thankfully, that's been accomplished in the vast majority of the world. And women have other issues now that are also very important, about access to leading positions in the workplace, and of course, the whole Me Too movement. And to say that once the women's movement was about suffrage, so that's what we're going to go back to and that's enough, that's also ludicrous. That's a complete dismissal of the very legitimate issues that women have in the Western world. So to say that Achad Ha'am or others, once wanted only a Jewish home or some sort without a state, Zionism has been completely committed to a state for almost 100 years. And I think, therefore, given the fact that that it would end the tremendous rebirth of the Jewish people in the Jewish state, what you want to really do is end the recreation of the Jewish people after the worst trauma that it suffered in 2,000 years. And I hate to use this term lightly, and I don't use it lightly, but I will say I think that someone who knows as much as Peter knows and who has the high-profile position that he has, I think that that's a red line that one dare not cross. And the one last thing that I'll say is, I know that American college students would ask me if I was willing to go on with him, well, why is it not okay for him to have an opinion? And I would say to them in response, you don't think that every opinion is okay. You wouldn't want me to get on a stage with somebody who says Black lives don't matter. You would say to me that it's perfectly legitimate to refuse to debate somebody who says that. And what I think Peter Beinart is saying is Jewish lives don't matter. And there's no reason that should be any more acceptable than Black lives don't matter. It's not acceptable. And as far as I'm concerned, he's crossed the line.
All right. Thank you for that. All right, we've got maybe 10 minutes maximum left, so we'll try and get a few questions in. And
I'll answer very briefly.
We'll try and do this as fast as we can. All right, the next question is, American Jewry has had little or no Zionist education for decades, that you cannot assume basic knowledge the same way maybe you can assume in Australia. So the question is, isn't the answer to start early and to make it engaging and interesting? And I would just add, if so, how would you do that, perhaps?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. I think that's what it's all about. It's not, and it's about, I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten calls from either schools or parents who say, my 12th grader is about to leave next year and go to university, and I realize that they don't really know enough to answer these questions on college campus. Can you help us put together a course? And the answer is no. And like my kid doesn't know anything about being Jewish, and I want them to be deeply committed to the Jewish world when they go to university. Can you help me teach them? No. And if my kid's not a decent human being, can you help me put together a course in 12th grade to make them a decent human being? No. I mean, you just can't do that. And I think you're 1,000% right. The question is, it's about doing this in a spiral kind of a way. We teach certain things in 1st grade and certain things in 4th grade and certain things in 7th grade all the way through. And it becomes much more sophisticated and so forth as time goes on. And just as I'm sure, in Australia, and I know this from our experience of meeting with a few community leaders in New Zealand, that education very much takes into consideration, for example, the First Nations and the indigenous peoples that were there and so on and so forth. And it's uncomfortable and it's very complex, but the educational system in New Zealand, and I'm sure Australia also, engages that head on. The same thing is, I think, what we need to do about what happened in Palestine. We were not the only people there. There were other people there too. They did suffer a national tragedy in 1947, 48, and 49. I'm not going to hide that from you, because even if I tried to hide it from you, you'd find out about it again. And therefore, what I want to do is engage it head on. So I think, yes, we have to make it engaging. It's got to be about Jewish film and about Jewish television and about, I'm not a big startup nation person, I have to say. I think it's fantastic what Israel's done. But Israel was not created in order to produce microchips. It just wasn't. The microchips are great for what it does for our economy and for, I mean, the UAE is interested in us because we have that. I'm not disparaging its importance, but it's not the purpose of the State of Israel. The purpose of the State of Israel is to reimagine Jewishness and to use literature and movies and television and all sorts of things to show them the incredible richness of the conversation happening in Israel about what it should mean to be a Jew. And then you can ask yourself the question, so what does it mean to be a Jew in Melbourne? What does it mean to be a Jew in Sydney? What does it mean to be a Jew in America? That, I think, makes Israel a kind of a spark plug for a serious conversation that impacts my life no matter where I live. So I think the answer is yes, and we have to make it much more engaging, but also not be afraid of historical chapters that might be uncomfortable.
Next question is, given there's a lot of attention at the moment on the UAE deal, everything that's happening with the peace accords and Arab communities flying in Saudi Arabia. So the question is, in light of the tectonic shifts happening in the Middle East, certainly in the last few weeks, how does that change, and does it change the narrative of Israel and how we talk about Israel education?
Yeah, I think it really should. It's a great question. I think it really should. And all I would point out is, you know, when I speak to young Americans about this in the last month or so, they're very worried. Oh my God, how is the world leaving the Palestinians behind? And my response is, ask yourself why. Why is Saudi Arabia willing to give Israel air rights, which is the first step towards normalizing relations? And why is Bahrain willing to do the same thing? And why is the UAE actually about to sign a deal in Washington on September 23rd? Why? Or I would ask the opposite question. Why are you as American Jews more concerned about the Palestinians than are the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain? Ask yourself that question, because what they've come to understand is that the Palestinians are simply stuck in history, ossified by very painful memory. I mean, we are Jews. We have plenty of painful memories that could have ossified us, but we have instead used those memories to fuel our desire to educate and create new generations and to build new communities wherever it was that we went. And Australia is the perfect example of that. Two very different communities came from two very different places in Sydney and Melbourne, but both of them built extraordinary communities. And I think the problem for American Jews is that they see the Israeli-Arab conflict as a civil rights issue. They see it as the issue, for example, of whites and blacks in North America. And they just can't get out of that paradigm, because that paradigm, as you see in the news today, is so overwhelmingly coloring what goes on in America. They just can't bring themselves to say that the Palestinians are rooted in an old paradigm. But what I really hope will come out of the UAE agreement is not only, obviously, did you see that, by the way, the UAE instructed hotels in the UAE that they have to offer kosher food and they should seek kosher certification right away? I mean, that's just unbelievable. You know, there's a lot of synagogues in America that I can go to where I can't get kosher food. But if I go to the UAE, I guess I can't get on an airplane right now, but one day when I can go to the UAE, I'll just be able to order kosher food in whatever hotel I end up in. It's kind of crazy, and it's exciting. And to hope that this will lead to some sort of recreation of Palestinian leadership, where they will say, actually, that map that I showed you, it's a map not only what they would say of, you know, they would say it's a map of unfairness. What I would say is it's a map of time running out. And it's time to grab opportunity where opportunity exists. To the vast, not would say the vast, but the majority of Israelis still do want there to be a two-state solution. You're not going to get the state that you wanted. You're not going to get all the land that you wanted. You're not going to have Israel's army out of all the places you want it out of. That's not going to happen. But why not build a better future for your children and grandchildren? My hope is that the UAE will spark a younger generation of Palestinians to think differently about their paradigm. Whether or not that will happen, you know, only time will tell.
Daniel, we've got two really quick questions. So one question was, it seems to be today, Israel and the Jewish communities in the diaspora are talking over each other, necessarily than to each other. How do we change that paradigm and get Israel and Jewish people in diaspora talking to each other and engaging? That's
critically important. I wrote a book last year about the relationship between American Jews and Israel. It was specifically about American Jews, called We Stand Divided. And I argue that that's exactly right, that we are actually talking, you know, beyond each other, by each other. Israelis need to, first of all, start taking diaspora Judaism much more seriously than they do. Israelis need to, don't forget, Zionism was at a certain point built on what was called denigration of the diaspora, Shlilat HaGolan. That was a phase of Zionism, and I think we've largely moved beyond it. Zionists, classic Zionist ideology saw the existence of diaspora communities as enigmatic and problematic, in the same way, by the way, that the Christian church saw the existence of the Jewish people as enigmatic and problematic. But I think that Zionism has gotten over that. And therefore, there's a tremendous amount to learn from how Jewish communities in Australia and in Europe and in North America have built themselves and recreated themselves. Israelis have a lot to learn from that, in the same way that diaspora communities have a lot to learn from Israelis about how nationalism fuels Jewish passion and so on and so forth. The presence of lots of Israelis in Australia and so many Australians coming to Israel is a hugely important part of that. By birthright has been instrumental in America in changing the percentage of American Jews of that generation who've gone to Israel. So it's very important, but we need to engage each other. We need to understand each other not only politically, because look, the politics are the least appealing part of this, and the conflict is the least appealing part of this. What I say to Americans is, if you taught your American students, let's understand how wonderful America is, and then say there was an independence war in 1776 and a war of 1812 and a civil war between 1861 and 65 and a First World War and a Second World War, and then a Korean War, then a Vietnam War, then an Iraq War, then an Afghanistan War, and I left a lot of them out. Who wants to be part of that? I mean, what makes America extraordinary is the democratic experiment, which is right now having a tough run, but America represented to the world. And what makes Australia extraordinary is the kind of highly varied community and heterogeneous community that's been built there that kind of works in a way that's the envy of many people around the world. Israelis have a lot to learn from the Australian Jewish community, and Israelis have a lot to learn from the American Jewish community. So I think it's important for this meeting and this mifgash to keep taking place. One of the terrible things, and there's many horrible things about COVID, and the most important one, of course, is the tragic loss of life and the tremendous health suffering. But way down on the list, but still important, is the fact that because air travel's become essentially impossible, these mifgashim are going to put a huge dent in our ability, or the absence of mifgashim is going to put a huge dent in our ability to learn around each other. And we have to be, just as we're thirsting to be able to get lots of people around our Shabbat table again, and just as we're thirsting to go back into a shul that will be packed with people singing again, we should be thirsting once again to have people going in both directions and flying and meeting each other, and not talking about the conflict, but talking about what makes each of our Jewish communities so extraordinary, so that we enrich each other and understand that the days in which we think one side or the other is going to survive, those days are gone. We're all in this together. And Australian Jews need a vibrant Israel, and Israeli Jews need a vibrant Australia and Europe and North America. We really need to learn from each other and see ourselves as one shared people with one shared destiny. And to the extent that we lose that, I think we're losing something very important.
Daniel, thank you so much for that. I couldn't think of a better way to end your words, I think, on such a hopeful and inspirational note. So thank you so much again. I wanted to hand over now to one of our vice presidents, Orly, who wanted to say a few closing remarks, as well as a few words about some of the initiatives that we're launching and doing in the Zionist Council. So Orly, I hand it over to you, and to formally thank again our guest speaker, Dr. Gordis.
Thanks so much, Asim. Yes, on behalf of the Zionist Council of New South Wales, I'd like to thank Daniel Gordis for his thought-provoking insights into Israel education, which I'm sure have given all of us, and in particular the educators listening in tonight, some real food for thought. With the guidance you've provided, Daniel, the prospects and future of Jewish education are looking like they have some questions to answer, and a lot of reflective process as we think about the new Jew and the reimagining. But all the while, our youth continue to foster deep connections to Israel through participation in Jewish community events like our Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron programs, Israel programs, and more generally, engagement with Israeli culture and the Hebrew language. Speaking of Hebrew, we are offering, and I can't help but plug, some Hebrew classes, which are running from the week of October 5th via Zoom. So there's a variety of levels, times, classes, and if you want more information, please email admin@zionistcouncil.com.au. Now, I'd like to also thank Asim. Great to see you. Thank you for everything and for all the fantastic work you do for the Zionist Council. Most of you would be aware the Zionist Council of New South Wales is not a fundraising organisation, so we do depend on support from the community in order to bring you events such as tonight's. So if you'd like to show your appreciation and support for the Zionist Council of New South Wales, feel free to click on the link in the Zoom chat or link in the comments section on Facebook Live. Back to Daniel, thank you again for inspiring us with a renewed focus on how we might encourage our young people in the diaspora to feel a positive connection to Israel. It is through people like you that we depend, and hence with all of our appreciation, we thank you for the important and necessary work that you're doing. So wishing you, your family,
for what you're doing, and Shana Tova to everyone.
And Shana Tova lekulam, to everyone. Thanks for participating tonight. And yeah, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Bye.
Shana Tova lekulam.